The prairie was a vast, unblinking eye of amber and dust, and in the center of its hollow gaze, Catherine stood on the porch, a silhouette carved from a long, tapering loneliness. Silas watched her from the shadow of the livery, his hand still against the rough cedar of a fence rail, his heart a heavy, unquiet thing that beat against his ribs like a bird in a cage of bone. She was looking toward the northern horizon, where the mountains turned to jagged teeth against the bruised light of dusk, waiting for a rider who had been swallowed by the high timber 3 winters ago. Between them lay 30 yards of parched earth, and a tension so thick it felt like a physical weight, a tether made of things they both knew and neither would ever speak aloud. He was a man who carried the black ash of a burned-out past in his lungs, and she was a woman whose soul was a house with every window left open for a ghost. The wind began its evening ritual, a low rhythmic sigh that stirred the fine silt around Silas's boots and tasted of dry sage and coming frost. He did not move. He simply existed in the periphery of her grief, a silent sentinel to a tragedy that wasn't his to claim, but was his to witness. He picked up a dented tin cup from the workbench, the metal cool and pocked with the scars of a dozen different camps. He dipped it into the cedar bucket, the water shivering silver in the fading light. He walked toward the house, his spurs making a muted, rhythmic chime against the hard-packed ground. He did not approach the porch directly. He stopped at the bottom step, offering the tin cup toward her without a word. Catherine turned slowly, her face a map of soft exhaustion, her skin parched by the same sun that had bleached the buffalo skulls in the coulee. She took the cup, her fingers grazing his for a fraction of a second, a contact that felt like a spark falling into dry tinder. She drank deeply, her throat moving in a slow, graceful rhythm, and for a moment the sound of the water swallowing was the only thing in the world. She handed the cup back, her eyes meeting his with a silent, devastating recognition of their shared solitude. The weeks that followed were measured not by the calendar, but by the shifting angle of the light across the kitchen floor and the gradual cooling of the evening air. Silas worked the ranch with a deliberate, quiet competence, mending fences that the wind tried to tear down and chopping wood until the rhythmic thud of the axe echoed through the draw like a heartbeat. He was a man with ghosts of his own, man he had failed in a war that felt like a fever dream, and a woman he had left at a station because he didn't think he was worth the stand. Catherine provided the labor, and he provided the presence. They moved around each other like two celestial bodies in a slow, careful orbit, never colliding, but always aware of the gravitational pull of the other. Every morning he would find her in the kitchen, the smell of wood smoke and parched coffee beans filling the air. He would bring in the morning's haul of water, the bucket heavy and cold, and he would pour her a tin cup of water, placing it on the scarred oak table while she worked the dough for the day's bread. It became a silent liturgy, a small daily gesture that said he was there, that he saw her thirst, and that he would provide what he could to slake it. In the afternoons, when the heat was a shimmering veil over the grass, Silas would sit on the top rail of the corral and watch her hang laundry. The white sheets snapped in the wind like the sails of a ship that refused to leave port. She never looked at him directly, but he saw the way she slowed her movements when he was near, the way her head would tilt toward the sound of his hammer. One day, a sudden gust tore a heavy quilt from the line and sent it tumbling into the dust. Silas was there before she could reach it. He shook it out, the fabric heavy and smelling of lavender and lye, and helped her drape it back over the line. For a moment, they were hidden from the world behind the wall of damp cotton, their faces inches apart. He saw the fine lines around her eyes, the way the light caught the gray in her hair, and he felt a sudden sharp ache in his chest, a longing not for romance, but for the simple right to stand beside her. She reached up to take the corner of the quilt from his hand, and again their fingers brushed. She didn't pull away this time. She let her hand rest against his for a long beat, her skin warm and alive against his weathered flesh. "It's a heavy thing to hold alone," she whispered, her voice a low rasp that seemed to vibrate in the space between them. "It is," Silas replied, his voice a low rumble, "but the wind helps it dry." "The wind takes more than it gives, Silas. You know that." He looked at her, his gaze steady and full of a quiet, unearned mercy. "It takes the damp, it leaves the rest." She went back to her work, but the air between them had changed. It was no longer a wall, it was a bridge. That night, as the crickets began their rhythmic pulse in the grass, Silas found her sitting on the porch steps, her head bowed. The wind was high, whistling through the eaves of the house with a mournful, searching sound. He sat on the step below her, his back against the peeling paint to the pillar. He didn't look at her. He watched the way the moonlight turned the dust motes into tiny drifting diamonds. He took the tin cup from beside him, it was always near now, and offered it to her. She took it, but instead of drinking, she just held it in her lap, the metal reflecting the stars. "I can't remember the sound of his voice anymore, Silas," her admission costing her something vital, her shoulders sagging as if a brace had been removed. "I try to pull it out of the air, but the wind, it just gives me back the sound of the grass. I'm afraid that if I stop waiting, he'll truly be gone, but I'm so tired of the waiting." Silas gripped his knees, his muscles tight. He thought of the names he had tried to forget, the faces that haunted his sleep. He knew the agony of the feeding ghost. "The waiting is just a door you've left unlatched, Catherine. It doesn't keep him here, it just keeps the cold coming in." She looked at him then, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "And what about you? Is your door latched?" "I burned the house down a long time ago," Silas said truthfully. "I'm just standing in the ruins trying to see if anything didn't turn to ash." "You're here," she said softly. "That didn't turn to ash." She reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder. It was a light touch, but it felt like the weight of the world. Silas closed his eyes, leaning into the contact, feeling the warmth of her palm through his flannel shirt. They sat that way for hours, two people suspended in the amber of a dying summer, watching the shadows of the clouds drift across the silvered plains. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of the things they were beginning to forgive in themselves. He realized then that his guilt didn't define him here. Here, he was just a man who brought water and mended fences. Here, he was the man who stayed. Autumn arrived with a sharp metallic tang that spoke of frost and the coming iron grip of winter. The grass turned the color of an old penny, and the sky deepened into a hard, brilliant blue. Silas spent the days stacking cordwood against the side of the house, each log a promise of warmth, a physical manifestation of a future he hadn't planned on having. Catherine spent more time watching him now, her gaze no longer searching the horizon, but anchored to the yard where he worked. She began to leave a lamp burning in the window for him, not for the man who was never coming back, but for the man who walked across the dark yard every night from the barn. One afternoon, a dust storm rolled in from the west, a towering red earth that blotted out the sun and turned the world into a claustrophobic howling gray. Silas fought his way from the corrals to the house, his bandana pulled tight over his face, his eyes stinging. He burst through the kitchen door, covered in a fine layer of grit, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Catherine was there, standing by the stove, her face pale in the unnatural gloom. She didn't panic. She simply took a cloth, dipped it into the bucket, and walked to him. Her touch, gentle and certain, began to wipe the dust from his forehead. Silas stood perfectly still, the roar of the wind outside seeming to feed into the background.
There was only the proximity of her, the scent of rain and old cedar, and the steady movement of her hand. "You shouldn't have gone out," she said softly, her thumb brushing the bridge of his nose. "The gate was loose," he rasped. "Didn't want the stock to scatter." She stopped her movements, her hand resting against his cheek. Her eyes searched his, looking past the miles and the mistakes, looking into the quiet, steady soul of the man he had become in her presence. She didn't look toward the northern horizon. She didn't look for the ghost. She looked at the man standing in her kitchen, covered in the earth of the place they both occupied.
Silas reached up, his large, calloused hand covering hers against his face. He felt the warmth of her skin, the life in her, and he realized that the past was just a story told by a man he no longer was. "I ain't going nowhere, Catherine," he said, the words a vow. "I know," she whispered. "I think I've known since the first time you brought me the water." The storm passed by nightfall, leaving the world scoured and silent. The moon rose over a landscape that looked entirely new, the drifts of red dust creating dunes where there had been hollows. Silas sat at the kitchen table, the lamp turned low. Catherine stood by the window, her back to him. The wind had died down to a whisper, a soft shushing sound in the eaves. She turned slowly and walked to the table. She picked up the tin cup. It was empty. She dipped it into the pitcher, the water silver and cold, and she walked over to Silas. She didn't set it on the table. She held it out to him with both hands, her gaze fixed on his with a terrifying, beautiful clarity. In that moment, the northern horizon vanished. The ghost in the timber was laid to rest, not by time, but by the weight of a man who was standing right there. Silas saw the shift in her, the way her shoulders finally let go of the burden of the distance, the way her eyes finally stopped searching the empty miles and found their home in his. She wasn't waiting for a rider anymore. She was choosing the man who held the cup. She stepped closer, the hem of her dress brushing his boots, her shadow merging with his on the floorboards. She lowered the cup, placing it on the table between them, and she reached out, her fingers interlacing with his. The silence in the room was absolute, a profound and healing peace that filled every corner of the house. She leaned forward, resting her forehead against his, her breath warm against his skin, and Silas felt the last of the black ash in his lungs vanish, replaced by the clean, sweet air of a world that was just beginning. "Catherine," she breathed, the name a final, quiet anchor. "I'm here, Catherine. I see you."